Okay, we are starting in the Gemara and Daf Tzadik Beis Amid Aleph in the wide lines towards the top of the wide lines. So we're holding it says for Rabbi Lezer. Rabbi Lezer says Kol Hanoisein Pitoy Lemisha Ein Boidea. If someone is to give from his bread or her bread to someone who has no dea, no das, no knowledge. Yisurim boyin alav, the person will suffer yisurim, which is different various of pains. How do we know? What's the proof? If you're going to put your bread to mazar, we'll see what mazar is in a second. Tachtecha ein tvua boy, a person who has no tvuna ein tvuna boy, has no bina, understanding, is going to have mazar tachtecha. You're going to have mazar under you. And what is mazar? Ve'ein mazar al yisurim. Mazar means to go through suffering. How do we know that a person suffers? Is connected to is connected to the idea of mazar. So he says, because it says Ashnemar vayar Ephraim es chalyav Yehuda es moizroi. Ephraim saw his illness, and Judah saw his mazar, which is the yisurim, the suffering. What's the connection to suffering and giving someone bread that is not lacking knowledge? So he says like this. I'm going to bring down a quote I see in the commentaries. We could explain this idea about what's the idea of not giving bread to someone with knowledge based on what it says in the tractate of Psachim. That it says, when God punished man, first man, and he said, you're going to have to eat from the grain of the growth of the earth. So it says, Zolgo ein of demois, he cried. Amar the fun of Ribbon Shalom said to God, Lord of the world, I'm going to eat with in the same basket or the same food bowl as my donkey, like I'm going to be eating like an animal. So he says, Hashem said, when God continued the curse, so to say, a first man after he ate from the tree of knowledge, and he said that in the sweat of your palm, you're going to eat bread. So it's not, you're not going to eat just grains like an animal, but you're going to be able to turn it into bread through processing the foods. Is niskara daita, so he was calmer. So he realized that man eats on a higher level than the animal. In the beginning, man thought because his food is like the food of the donkey, meaning to say his knowledge is going to be like an animal. I mean, he's going to eat like an animal, he's going to behave like an animal, he's going to think like an animal. He said the way an animal eats is a sign of his nature. That God said, no, you're going to eat differently. You're going to eat in a sophisticated food based on the fact that you're able to process the food into human food. And we know that that it says, it's brought down, the Gemara says a person doesn't know how to say Abba, can't say my father, until they can't call out to their parents, doesn't have the knowledge to know who their parents is until they had the taste of bread. We know we talked about that on Pesach, that Pesach, eating the matzah, the Jewish people, when they ate matzah, that was when they ate tam lechem in a way of holiness, they're able to know that God's their father. So we know that bread gives das. So therefore, v'niskara daite. Therefore, he says, "V'chein zeh shenoisen lechem la'adam she'emei das." So if a person gives bread to a person who doesn't have the knowledge of life, doesn't use their human quality to elevate themselves above being an animal. So shehu roi hachamar. Hey Judith. And if a person is, we're middle of page 92a. So if a person is going to behave, not going to have das, is going to behave like an animal, so it's considered a chet. So therefore it says a person who gives bread, and bread is a food of knowledge, and brings knowledge and is the sign of an elevation of the human species over the animal kingdom. So therefore, if you're going to give bread to a person who has no das, so you're lowering the concept of bread, and therefore it says it's considered a chait to the fact that it says you're going to have yisurim, you're going to suffer sufferings. Okay. Rabbi Lezer says, Kol Adam She'ein Boidei, a person who has no knowledge, is l'soif goyla. Eventually, that person is going to be exiled. So, well, where do we know that? So he says, Shenemar, as it says, that Lachein Gola Ami Mibli Das. My people were exiled because they had no das, they had no knowledge. So we see that knowledge, bringing knowledge, keeps a person away from being exiled. Again, knowledge is being aware. Godly awareness is going to keep a person away from personal or general concept of exile. He said, that's what's lacking. This is if we're talking in a way of Chassidus a bit, to say Rosh Hashanah, that das is the main of the midos that makes Yiddishkeit and godliness real. So if a person doesn't have das, so you're not real with your Yiddishkeit, with your Torah mitzvahs. And if that's the case, it ends up leading a person into gullus, into exile, meaning to say, not that the lack of knowledge leads a person to exile, but when you're lacking knowledge, it's going to cause behaviors that's going to lead you into exile. Okay, he continues. Rabbi Lezer says, Kol bayis, any home, she'ein divrei Torah nishma'im by b'layla, that we don't hear words of Torah at night, is eish achlasai. So fire is going to consume that house. Shenemar, as it says, what is the verse to say that a house that has no Torah is going to be, the fire is going to consume the house. So it says, Kol chayshach tamen litzfainav teichluhu eish leinafuach yera shirid ba'oila ein shirid ele tamid chacham. So it says like this. The verse says, all darkness is laid up for his treasures, a fire not fanned shall consume him. So a fire that doesn't even need to be fanned, I mean to say, doesn't need to be worked up, is going to consume a person, a person's home. Why? It shall go ill as with a sarid in his tent. And what is a sarid? It means it's because there's lacking a sarid in his tent. And what is a sarid? Ve'ein sarid edel Talmud Chachamim. And a sarid means a Talmud Chacham. And because a person does not have a Talmud Chacham, so to say, there's no Torah in their house, it's going to be a house that's not going, it's going to be a house that's going to be consumed by fire, like it says, Ubesridim Asher Hashem Kara. It's talking about the people that are Siridim is people who call to Hashem, meaning the calling of Torah. And that's a house of darkness. A house of darkness, a house that has no Torah in it. Okay, it says, the commentaries of his says, the Rashi says also, Rashi says, what does it mean that there's darkness in the house? Rashi says, any house that's dark from the light of Torah at night, that there's no Torah in the house, like the commentaries say, maybe if you work the whole day and you get home and you learn at night when you have a little free time, so it shows that you really want to learn Torah. But you're busy, you're working, so you can't. But when you come home, you try to learn a bit. The person doesn't learn Torah by day, and then comes home at night and also just relaxes and doesn't learn Torah. So therefore, it's a house of darkness. So it says, "Tachlu eish le'neifach ze eish shel gehenim." What fire are we talking about? We're not just talking about a physical fire. We're talking about the fires of hell. She'ein tzar nefuach doesn't require any fanning, like you fan a fire. The fire of hell are obviously strong enough to not need any fanning. So Rashi says, what does it mean, Yara Srid Ba'ayalai? Mishra Be'enav Sheyesh Srid Ba'ayalai. What does it mean, Yara Srid, that he has evil from the word? So he says that Rashi says a person who doesn't want to have a Torah scholar or scholarship in their home. I think he says, over here he quotes the Marsha, that he says, the Marsha over here quotes, that the Marsha says Shmeduber bebal habayis. The Marsha says, like I said, it's talking about a homeowner she'ein Talmud Chacham, that's not himself a Talmud Chacham, means a Torah scholar. Why is there no Torah in his house, in their house, so to say? Is because they're at work. But if at night, when you're not at work, there's no Torah. That means it's not just that the person couldn't learn Torah because the person's busy working, because they have no interest in learning Torah. And therefore the Marshal says that the person's not the house, so to say, is going to be burnt down, but that the fires of hell are going to consume this family. Had there been the sound of Torah in the people's home, so the Marshal says, if you would have fire in the home, the fires of hell, the fires of Torah would consume, like it says in the Torah. Torah is a fire that consumes fire. It consumes the fires of negativity. And because you don't have the fires of Torah in your home, so that's the only thing that doesn't even require fanning is the Torah, is the fires of Torah. So he says like this. Okay, he continues. Rabbi Lezer says, a person who has ownership of things, but doesn't include to benefit the Torah scholars in their things, the nechasav, in the things that you own. You'll never see a sign of blessing in your life, so to say, in your efforts. Shenemar, like it says, Ein sirid la'achlai alkein la'yachel tuvai. So it says, he quotes the verse that says like this. He says, none of his food shall remain, means he won't have blessing because there'll be no more food. Therefore, his prosperity shall not endure. Means he won't have, because the ain't sirid la'achlei, there won't be remains. It doesn't just mean there won't be remains. If there's no sirid, if there's no Talmud Chacham in his food, in their food, so lo yachil toiv, there won't be any prosperity with this family, so to say, because they're not benefiting the Torah scholars. It's one thing if you're not learning Torah yourself, but if you're not going to be benefiting others to learn Torah, so then you're not going to see blessings in your efforts, in your bread, in your home. Like it says, Ein Sirid El Talmid Chachamim, and what does it mean? There's no Sirid in your food. There's no Talmid Chachamim enjoying your food. Shnemo B'Sridim Asher Hashem Karo. And he says like this, like he quotes the same verse, that the Sridim that call out to God, which means those who study Torah. V'Omer Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol She'ein Mishar Pas Al Shulchanei, whoever doesn't leave a little bit of bread on their table, means you have food that you're eating, and you eat everything, right? You don't leave any of the food. So it says, any roisim bracha, so it's not a good sign. It means to finish every single bit of food of your in your child. Your parents say, your mother says, or your father says, finish everything. So the Gemara says, if it was a wise child, could quote the Gemara in Sanhedrin in page 92, that says that whoever doesn't leave a little bit of food left over is not going to see a siman bracha, a sign of blessing. La'olam ever. Shnemar. So how do we know that there's no blessing for a person who does not leave a little bit food left over? And obviously, the idea of over here is that it's kind of unlike what the mother is telling to the child, which is, when it comes to children, it's true. But it's over here, it's talking about it's not a good sign. A person who finishes every single piece is like it's a bit of it comes from this place of a greediness. So he says, what's the verse? He quotes the same verse. If there's no sirid, in this case, it doesn't mean Talmid Chacham, it means actually leftovers. If there's no leftovers on your plate, you're not going to see a blessing. So here he translates the same verse that we were referring to Srid to mean Torah scholars. Here he means the Srid, the actual translation, which means if there's no leftover, so then there's not going to be a blessing. And let's see, the commentaries say, because there's a verse. He doesn't quote this in the Gemara, but he quotes a verse in the Tzarech L'Shar. A person must, Rashi says, She'ein Mishar B'Mipitan Epsisin. They don't leave a little bit of bread left over or little crumbs. It says Tzarech L'Shar K'Dichsiv Ochel V'Hoiser. When God spoke to Elisha, he said, "Eat and leave over." So the idea of eat and leave over is a sign that you have to leave something over. So the Gemara asks a question, but what are you saying that that a person who doesn't leave over is a bad sign. Rabbi Lezer said, "Kol hamashayir psisim al shulchan kilo over the zara." We have another Rabbi Lezer that says a person who does not leave, who leaves pieces of bread on their tables as if you worshipped idols. We'll see why in a second. So which one is it? First you say you don't see any blessing, and here it says it's like you're serving idols. Shenemar, how do we know? It says orchim the God shulchan because there's a verse that says that there was an avodah zarah that was called God, and it says in the verse that who prepares a table for fortune of God and offers blended wine for destiny, which is also a type of idol worship. So it means that they would leave foods out after they ate for the idols, and that's a sign of a person who serves idols. So the Gemara answers, not like Kash, it's not a question. The difference is that the people that worshipped idols would take out a special loaf of bread after they ate and add it to the crumbs or to the leftovers. Whereas a person who doesn't leave, just leaves the crumbs. Now the idea is also, it says, I just want to go back. The original Gemara that says whoever doesn't leave pieces of bread on the table is not going to have a sign of blessing. The first statement, and we quoted the verse in Malachim that says that Hashem said to Elisha, "Oichel v'hoiser, you should eat and leave over." So he quotes over here, the Ein Yaakov says that what you don't just leave over and it goes to waste. He says like this: "Shekol." You have to leave over bread. Like it says, God told Elisha, you should eat and leave over. And he says like this: and if you're very exact, if you bring a very exact amount of food to your table, that's not an attitude. God liked broadness, So there's a concept of having broadness, not to be so exact. Like it says by Elisha, which is a sign of harchava, broadness is that he had enough food to leave over. And it says like this, and because there's God's blessing in a bread of broadness, therefore it's a sign that God wasn't giving you a limited amount. It's also bad, you're giving a bad sign to God. You're saying God only is able to give me an exact amount of food, although you could say that's a good thing, that God knows exactly how much I need. But he says, the Ein Yaakov says, it's not that the bread goes to waste, but if you leave bread pieces on your table is so there's the poor people who come by and eat the shirayim, and unfortunately that's their only source of food, is to eat from the leftovers. So then you could say toiv ayin, a person who has a good eye, a person who's looking to help others, who yivarach is blessed, and therefore you're blessed when you leave over for others on your table, for others to eat the leftovers. But then the Gemara says, but we find that another statement of Rabbi Lezer says, whoever leaves over bread is a sign of idol worship. So he says, not a question. This is if you add a complete bread to what's there, or if you just leave what's left over. And Rashi says, like this. Why? So he says, that's what they used to do. They would actually set a table for the idols, God that was called God, and they would fill glasses of wine for another idol that was called Mani. So for Mani and God, they would serve wine and bread, but that's again a person who is adding to it. So he says, Rashi continues, this that it says is forbidden, that they would bring out a full piece of bread or full loaf of bread after the ate, and specifically place it with the leftover bread. And then it's a sign that you're doing it for Avodah Zarah. But when it talks about in the beginning that it's a sign of blessing to leave over, but if you leave over and it's just the leftovers, then it's a sign you're just giving it for the poor. It's not like you're setting the table for the idols. I mean, obviously one could ask the question that maybe on the contrary, if you're leaving food for the poor, why would you not leave? Why would it make sense to bring out full food so the poor could eat full food? But here it seems to say that that the leftovers is what is a sign of blessing, and if you're giving it for the poor, whereas if you're like Rashi clearly says it's leaving it for the poor, whereas if it's for if you're bringing out specifically, it's a sign more of avodah zarah. Again, I think one could, if you want to get into the psychological of it, is if you really wanted a poor person to join you at the meal, you would have invited them in the first place. The very fact that they're not initially at your meal to eat with you is a sign that you don't really have them in mind. If you have a full loaf of bread to bring out and it's just for the poor, then why would you have not invited them initially? So it's talking about a person that first is, I mean, in theory, takes care of themselves. And whatever they have left over, they give the shiraim, the leftovers, to the poor. So although it's not a perfect behavior, because you didn't invite them initially, but at least you're leaving, it's a toivah, and you're leaving, you have a good eye to leave over. You don't need everything. You know, the question is, how do you approach your food? Do you approach your food and say, listen, I have to eat. When I reach a certain level of satisfaction, I'm going to make sure I'm not going to stuff myself. I'll leave for the poor to have left over. But if you really wanted the poor person at your table, you would have initially invited them. So the very fact that they were initially invited means that it wasn't like if you're bringing out a whole new loaf of bread, then you already would have invited them in the beginning. So the very fact that you're bringing out a loaf of bread after you finish eating is a sign, possibly, this is my own idea, is a sign that it's not for the poor people. It's another type of idea, which is considered idol worship, because they would serve the god and the money, these kind of things. So it has nothing to, it's another form of benefiting you. What's idol worship? It's about you, right? So it's about another form of benefiting you. It's not about someone else. If it was someone else, he would have invited that someone else to sit at the table initially. Possibly that's the pshat. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. I mean, if you're talking about leaving,
It's always good when you go off this way. You did something on the rebellious son and tied it to addiction. You know, as an example, at least in our age, very, very insightful and helpful. So I thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. I'm assuming that's the pshat, but we could hopefully hope that that is the pshat. If not, maybe we'll find something else. But okay, the Gemara continues. It says, where are we holding? Rabbi Lezer says like this. Rabbi Lezer says like this. Kol hamachlif b'dibur kilo v'devad zara. A person, what's machlif? Machlif is, I think I want to see what Rashi says. Rashi says, Mishana b'dibur shlo yir nikar. You manipulate your speech so it shouldn't be obvious. Nikr means obvious. So you're kind of basically not saying a clear lie, but you're manipulating your words to manipulate the message. So kol hamachlif b'dibur kilo v'devad zara is this form of idol worship. How do we know? Because it says over here, meaning by the story of Jacob, of Yaakov, and his discussion with Rivka regarding trying to, so to say, fool their father, Yitzchak, to bless him. So he's going to come in the disguise of Esav. So he says, I'm going to be like a person who's kind of mitateya. I'm misleading my father. And it says, and it says it's not good, the acts of tatuim. So we see clearly that it's not and then in the second verse is talking about idol worship. So we see that a person who's not being clear with their words and manipulating the words is a form of idol worship. What's idol worship? Idol worship is that it's not, you're lacking in trust in Hashem. It's a form of lack of bitachon, and that's why you're not saying straight statements and you're saying manipulative statements. Okay, that's there's a lot of gray area there. Just know, but Yaakov then did do it, right? So it says like this. V'amar Rav Lezer says, "Kol mistakel be'erva kashlein nina eres." A person who looks at inappropriate things when it comes to sexual ideas is going to his kashta. He's not going to have strength in his ability to perform. Shenemer, as it says, eryei te'or kashtecha. That it's going to, if you have a erva, it's going to waver in your bow and arrow. But Amar Rabbi Lezer says, so he says it means basically he says it's not going to be productive for you to have children. Amar Rabbi Lezer says like this: have a kabel v'kayim. It's an interesting Gemara. It says Rabbi Lezer says that a person is talking about humility, not humility. He's talking about it doesn't. He's like this. It's interesting. It does how it falls into this discussion. It says that it says forever be in the dark. So what does it mean? Heavy kabel of the kayim, always be, so to say, in the dark. It means anonymous. And then if you're going to be vikibel, if you're going to be in the dark, is vikayim, you're going to exist. Meaning to say, staying anonymous, staying under the radar, what we would call, is a good strategy for sticking around. Don't draw attention to yourself. I think Rashi quotes the idea of ayin hara. Rashi says, Hevei anav, be humble. Doesn't use the word under the radar. Be humble. Don't be v'tichya and you'll live. Like he says, kibol means lashon ofel, like dark. Asay atzmacha ofel v'shafel. Keep sort of say darkness around you. I mean, you say don't have to shine everything about you that would draw attention to yourself. If you want to stay, you want to have a chance to be around, so to say, is the way to do it is by staying under the radar. I just want to say, I saw somewhere, it says the idea of ayin hara. It says, here it says, Kiba, so he quotes Rashi, pretend like you're in darkness. Don't show yourself before others. The Maharsha says, so you won't draw jealousy. This Gemara is as true today as it was 2,000 years ago. So you shouldn't draw jealousy from others because you're drawing attention to yourself. The ayin hara and the evil eye. That's another whole discussion on its own, the concept of the power of the evil eye. Rab Zera says, Afananami Tanina, we also learned another concept that's similar to this. It says, Bayis oifel ein poischel lechalanius liris nigoy. So, Shmamina, what is this talking about? So Rashi says this is referring to a house that has a leprosy. So the part of it is that the Kohen has to see, but how do you avoid that there should be no visual to see that there's leprosy, and therefore there's no pronunciation that the house is impure, and the concept, the house doesn't become impure until the Kohen says it's impure, is by keeping things dark. If you saw everything wrong in your home, so then all of a sudden you're exposing the opportunity for there to be, oh, look, maybe there's a piece of tzaras over there. There's a little bit of tzaras over there, and the Kohen comes and says, your whole home isn't a pure home. Better not to see too much, not to draw attention to the problem. He's saying it he's using the opposite side. That by the very fact you were trying to expose everything and show everything, all of a sudden what is visual is not the positive, is the negative. The Kohen comes and says it's not so there's not nice things in the house. Rabbi Lezer says like this. What does he say? He says that he says, what does it say? She'oil v'oitzirechem eretz loy siva amayim. So it's talking about Sheol is the abyss, which is where people go after, obviously, where a person's buried. So it says the Sheol, v'oitzirachem, a womb that has not had a child yet, that's barren, and the land are never loisavamayim, that is never it doesn't have enough water. So that they're all three they're put into a single category. The pasuk says it's talking about he quotes over here. The shalish heni light to savannah. This says v'arbelei amruhain. It says there's three things that are never satisfied. Sha'oil, it says the grave. Rechem, a barren womb, which is always waiting to have a child. Ve'eretz, and the earth that doesn't have enough. Never has enough water. So it says. So the question is, so it says about the earth that why is the earth hungry because it doesn't have enough water? It's not satisfied because it doesn't have enough water. But what's the connection to Sha'ol and Rachel? What's the connection between the abyss, the grave, and the womb? It doesn't say what they're hungry for, so to say. So he says, meaning to say, as if the grave always wants to have dead in it, and the womb always wants to have the ability to have children in it. So the Gemara says like this. Amar TV, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, what's the connection between a grave and a barren womb? It's coming to tell you, just like the womb takes in the seed and moitzi takes out the child, so too the grave takes in the grave. The womb wants life, exactly. So the womb wants life, but it takes the life and it gives it out. So too the grave takes in death and brings back out life. It means whatever it takes in, it takes out. And here he says, this is a kal v'chomer. So when it comes to when the pregnancy comes in silent, and when the child is born comes with cries, the baby that's born is crying, meaning the grave that takes it in with crying, right? When you bury someone, the loved ones cry. And he didn't also that when the means it's a sign of the resurrection of the dead. It means when the people leave the grave, it should come with sounds. And here he says, finally, again, we're going back to the original conversation. Here we see again that this is the sign that there's going to be the resurrection from the Torah, because it talks there's a pasuk that connects the grave to the womb, and just like the womb takes in and also gives out, so too the grave takes in the dead people, but they will eventually go out. And what's Rashi say? What is the koile? It's just a very connection to this to Rosh Hashanah. So he says, what does it mean that a grave takes in with cries? So Rashi says, usually, traditionally, when a person dies, there's those who cry. The loved ones are crying. Also, when the people are going to leave the grave, should also be with crying. And what is that? Rashi says, what is the cries that we're going to have? The resurrection of the dead is going to be the day of the blowing of the great shofar. Also, the Kadosh Baruch Hu says that this is what's going to be when the Mashiach comes. There's going to be the resurrection of the dead is going to be with the koilos, with the sounds of the blowing of the shofar. Tanad Ve'Eliyahu. We're going to go a little further. We have to stop a little earlier today because getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. It says Tanad Ve'Eliyahu. We learned in the yeshiva of Eliyahu. Tzadikim Shasa Kadosh Baruch Hu Lachiyoi Son. Those righteous that are going to be resurrected with the coming of Mashiach. Again, so we're going to go into now. We're just going to start this in the next class. We'll tackle it a little more deeper about the different times of the resurrection of the dead. There's and this is the Hagdama, the Rambam, and there's the Hagdama, the preface to this Preke Chelek that talks about that there's the resurrection of the dead. There's different times and different peoples that are going to be resurrected. There's those who are going to wake up right away and experience the entire coming of Mashiach. And there's those that are going to be resurrected at the designated time of the resurrection of the dead. So therefore, the Tanad Ve'Eliyahu says that also Kadosh Baruch Hu L'Hachiyosei, that tzaddikim, the righteous that God is going to resurrect in Ein Chayzin Afram will not go back to earth, meaning others will go back to earth. The people that were alive, there's going to be, according to some opinions, according to this Gemara, there's going to be a time where people go back. Everyone's going to die, but the righteous that are going to be resurrected before are not going to die. So it says, and they're not going to go back to earth. Shneimar v'haya hanishar, as it says, those B'tzion v'anoiser b'Yerushalayim. There's going to be the leftovers of Zion and Jerusalem, the remainees of Zion and the leftovers of Jerusalem. Kaddish Yomer Loi, Kol HaKosav L'chaim, B'Yerushalayim, Ma Kodesh Baruch Hu L'Olam Kaim, Af Heim L'Olam Kaim. So just like God is always going to be alive, so too are they also going to always be alive. So if that's the case, they're never going to go back to the earth. Now the Gemara doesn't say, again, we'll get back to this Gemara again, but the Gemara says like this. So what is going to happen? We know that there's a tradition. There's going to be a kind of a restart of the world. A God is going to be alone on that day. Meaning, say everyone's going to die, and it's like Rashi is going to say, what does it mean? That what's going to happen when a God is going to renew the world? Rashi says there's going to be 1,000-year period where the world is going to be destroyed, and then God's going to restart the world, and then there's going to be a resurrection of the dead for everyone. But what about those righteous? He said the righteous are not going to go back to the earth. So what are they going to do in that 1,000 years? So Eisan Tzadikim Rashi says, if they're not going to be buried, and the world is going to be destroyed, what's going to be with them? So it says, God is going to make them wings of eagles, others say of the chor bird that lives forever, and like they're going to live forever. And and they're going to surface over the waters, which is where the earth is going to be destroyed. And they're going, like he quotes a verse that says they're going to be, if there's going to be no land, they're going to be over the water. So the Quran says, maybe it's going to be hard for them to be, floating over the water for 1,000 years. So he says, he quotes the verse, let me just translate the verse in English. He quotes the verse that says, so he says, the Holy One, blessed be He, will make wings like eagles for them, and they will fly over the surface of the water, as it is stated. Therefore, he will not fear when God changes the land. The tzaddik won't be scared when he changes the land. And when the mountains are moved in the midst of the sea, means to say when there's a destruction. And so because they're going to be surfing over they're going to be surfing over the water. So maybe you're going to say that they're going to be suffering in that period. So he says, he quotes the verse, but they who wait for the land, meaning the tzaddikim that are waiting for the land, shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles, and they shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not tire. So from Isaiah is quoting that they're going to have vigorous strength to be able to sustain themselves, and not have to be tired, even though they're waiting 1,000 years for the world to be created. We're going to stop here, and the Gemara is going to continue with the question about the dead that were resurrected by the prophet Yecheskel, which is going to be a very interesting Gemara, who they were and why isn't that not a sign of the resurrection of the dead. But before we close, I just want to finish up with a little Mefarshim. It says, he quotes like this, we say for Orach Chama, we talk about the 1,000 angels, that the 1,000 angels that were it does take a lot more study. So he's like this. He quotes a sefer that says, Orach Chama, Kosev B'Shem Rav Chaim Vital. Sheshtei Tchiyas Yiyah, there'll be 2 resurrections of the dead. Achas b'Yimos Mashiach, one in the days of Mashiach, v'achas oz yakumu, v'asher oz yakumu mikivreim, v'oz yizdachach choymrim k'tzas, v'yiskaimu b'Yimos Mashiach. There's going to be the resurrection of the dead. That's going to happen in the times of Mashiach, and there's going to be refinement. V'yiyu oichlem v'shoysim, people who eat properly, v'tar b'kedusha, in purity. But in the world to come, which is after this period, she'az neimer she'ein b'yachil v'shir, there will be no eating and drinking. There's going to be a greater refinement that's required. And therefore, it's going to be the day of judgment, the great day of judgment. And then everyone's going to die a little bit. And they're going to get a greater refinement. There's going to be a time that there's going to be, basically, he says, there's going to be a time where there's going to be a second resurrection of the dead, and evidently the tzaddikim, the righteous, won't need this second resurrection because they're going to be very refined on the first one, and in that period of time, they're going to be with wings that are, so to say, floating and not needing to be sustained by. They're gonna have the energy to not, it's not gonna be tiring for them to be in that transition moment. And he quotes this other thing. He quotes the riff over here. Different opinions, but from Rashi it says, Rashi seems to say that okay, Rashi doesn't. Which I think he's quoting the Rashi somewhere else. Says he brings on the riff that says, Rashi said before, what time is this? When is this going to be? Rashi says it's going to be the Moisei Mashiach and Elam Haba, and they're not going to have to. They're going to live until the time the Olam Haba. They're not going to have to go through the second, evidently, what the Chaim Vital says, the second refinement. All right, Judith, and all those who are on YouTube and watching later would like to wish you all a good Ben Shar, and Mr. Shem will continue and maybe have more insight on this Gemara and continue with the stories of the dead that were resurrected by the Prophet Yecheskel next year, and that will be next week. Ayla Tov, take care. Thanks for joining.